had been planning the trip for months. Just me, my truck, and the open wilderness. I had been feeling burned out, stretched thin by work and life in general, and I needed to get away. I wasn't new to solo camping. I had done it plenty of times before, and I always found it peaceful. Something about being completely alone out in nature made me feel more like myself, like I could breathe again. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, a place far from the usual campgrounds, where I wouldn't have to worry about running into noisy tourists or weekend campers with blaring music and bright lanterns. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of a river. I had studied the maps, checked the weather, made sure I had everything I needed. I packed my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, cooler, enough food and water to last a few days, plus my knife and bear spray, just in case. The drive was long, winding up through back roads that turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, it was late afternoon, and I was the only person for miles. I set up camp in a clearing near the tree line, with a good view of the valley below. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was perfect. I got my fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night, watching the flames flicker against the dark. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke up suddenly. The fire burned low, the night completely still. No wind, no rustling in the trees, just silence. I stretched, got up, and banked the fire before climbing into my tent. The night was cool, and the ground was firm beneath my sleeping bag. As I zipped myself in, I felt that small flicker of unease, the kind that always comes when you're alone in the wild. Not fear, just the awareness that I was truly, completely by myself. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. No noise had woken me, no sudden movement, just that same strange feeling from earlier, like something was off. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my camp. I froze. My mind immediately went through the possibilities. An animal, maybe a deer, wandering close. A bear? But the steps weren't heavy enough for that. I stayed still, heart pounding, ears straining to pick up every sound. The footsteps circled, not coming closer, not moving away, just circling. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The bear spray was within reach too, but I didn't move yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, knife in hand, waiting, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came, bright and crisp, as if the night before had never happened. The fire pit was undisturbed, my gear untouched, but something felt wrong. I stood and stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine, not boot prints, bare feet pressed into the dirt around my tent, circling my camp. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The prints were fresh. Someone had been out here walking around my camp while I slept. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but the woods were still. Whoever it was, they were gone now. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They were small, not child-sized, but not large either. The toes dug into the dirt, meaning whoever it was had been moving slowly, carefully. I straightened up and took a deep breath. I didn't like this. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, every movement feeling too slow, my back prickling with the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop to eat, didn't bother with breakfast. I just needed to get out of there. As I threw the last of my stuff into the truck, I took one last look at the footprints. They were leading away from my camp now, back into the trees. But there was something else. A set of them coming back. Whoever it was had left before sunrise. But before that, at some point in the night, they had stopped circling and stood right outside my tent, listening. I got in my truck and left without looking back. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, hiking, camping. I know what's out there. I know the animals, the sounds, the way the forest breathes. I never thought I'd be scared of something as simple as a dog. This happened 2 years ago. I still can't explain it, but I know what I saw. I was on a solo hunting trip deep in the forest, about 15 miles from the nearest road. No trails, no campsites, just untouched wilderness. That's how I liked it. Quiet, empty, real. I was after deer, and I knew this area was good for it. I had my rifle, enough food for a few days, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of being alone in the woods. I should have left the second I saw the tracks. I had hiked in during the morning, set up my camp near a small creek, and spent most of the day scouting. As the sun started dipping, I found the first set of prints. They looked like dog tracks, big ones, but there was something off about them. The spacing was wrong, too far apart, like whatever left them had an unnatural stride. And the claws dug deep, deeper than any wolf or stray should have. Something about them made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just a big dog, maybe a lost hunting hound. It happens. People lose dogs out here. But as I kept walking, I noticed the prints circled my camp. Not a straight path, a circle. That's when the unease set in. A dog wouldn't just pace around a camp and leave. If it was lost or hungry, it would have come straight in. I followed the tracks a bit longer until I lost them in the underbrush. I shook it off and headed back to camp. I built a fire, ate my food, and sat listening to the woods settle into night. The air was cold, the fire crackling, and the forest alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the trees. Then, just after midnight, the woods went silent. The silence. I woke up suddenly, not because of a noise, but because of the lack of one. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know that silence is never good. It means something big is near. Predator. A bear, maybe. I reached for my rifle, sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, and listened. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Steady. Just outside my tent. I went still, every muscle locking up. It wasn't the heavy huffing of a bear. It wasn't the quick, sniffing breaths of a deer. It was controlled, even, almost deliberate. Then came the sound of paws on the dirt. A slow step, then another, not wandering, pacing, circling my tent. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My brain told me it was just a stray dog. Coyote, maybe, but my gut told me something was wrong. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The steps stopped. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an hour before finally laying back down. I didn't sleep. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The sounds of the woods returned, the usual birds and wind in the trees. But when I stepped outside my tent, my stomach dropped. The tracks were back. Deep, clear, circling my tent over and over and over. And then I saw something worse. Across the clearing, in the trees where the light barely reached, something had dug into the dirt. A long, deep trench like an animal had been lying there. Watching, I felt exposed, like I had been studied all night. I packed up my rifle and decided to hunt closer to camp that day. I didn't want to be out too far if whatever this was came back. The day was quiet, too quiet. I saw no deer, no squirrels, not even a bird. The whole forest felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I headed back to camp, the sun getting low, I caught movement in the trees. I stopped, gripping my rifle. Then I saw it. A dog, big, black, sitting perfectly still between the trees, half in shadow. It wasn't panting. It wasn't moving, just watching. I stared at it, my pulse pounding. It didn't look like a stray. Its body was too thin, its legs too long. Its head was low, its eyes locked onto mine. I took a step back. It stood up, not like a dog standing from a sitting position. It rose, slowly, deliberately. I lifted my rifle. My instincts screamed to aim, but something in me, some deep primal fear, told me not to. I backed away, step by step, never looking away. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, watching. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was almost gone. I built the fire high. My hands were shaking as I ate. The feeling of being watched never left. That night, I didn't go inside my tent. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, waiting. And sure enough, it came back. I saw the eyes first, low to the ground, just beyond the fire's glow. Two dim, yellow eyes, unblinking, watching me. Then movement. The dog stepped forward, just enough for me to see it clearly. Its ribs stuck out beneath matted fur. Its legs were too long, its back slightly arched. It was like a dog stretched too far, like something wearing a dog's skin but not knowing how to fit inside it. Took another step. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. Then it lowered its head to the ground and started crawling toward me. Not walking, not running, crawling. Its belly pressed to the dirt, legs moving unnaturally, its eyes never leaving mine. That broke me. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees. The firelight flickered. When I looked back, it was gone. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my pack, doused the fire, and ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about moving quietly. I just moved, fast. Every so often, I'd stop to listen. Every time I heard it, pause on the dirt, following, not running, not attacking, just following. I don't know how long I hiked before I saw my truck through the trees. I sprinted, threw my gear inside, and tore down the road, gravel spraying behind me. Only when I hit the highway did I stop to breathe. I never went back. I don't know what I saw. A sick dog? A wolf with mange? Some rabid stray? I tell myself that. I try to believe it. But deep down, I know the truth. It wasn't a dog, and it wasn't afraid of me. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. At first, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. A kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington state. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first, the prickling at the back of my neck, the sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual, but then I heard something. A soft crunch, not close but not far either, somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified, the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step, closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words, Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancé had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancé climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled, couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood, never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people, no old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Or maybe I was just being stupid. Either way, when my friend Matt told me about his uncle's cabin and how he needed someone to watch over it for a week, I said yes. The idea of being alone in the woods didn't scare me at first. I'd gone camping before, spent nights outdoors, and I figured a week away from work and distractions would be good for me. No emails, no meetings, no people. Just me, a few books, and the sound of nature. But the moment I turned onto that dirt road leading to the cabin, something felt off. The trees pressed in too close. The road was barely wide enough for my car. The sun was starting to set, and the light filtering through the trees cast long shadows that made everything look stretched and distorted. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place getting to me. I kept driving. After a few more miles, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I expected, just a simple wooden structure with a sagging porch and a single window on the front. There was no other house for miles. No cell service either. My bars had disappeared almost an hour ago. I parked, got out, and stretched. The air was cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead, just trees. I grabbed my bag and headed up to the porch. The key was right where Matt said it would be, under a loose board near the door. The lock was stiff, the door heavier than it looked, but it creaked open after a few tries. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in a while. The cabin was one large room, bed in the corner, small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs. There was a fireplace, a few oil lamps on the shelves, and a single door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. It wasn't cozy, but it was enough. I set my bag down, checked the supplies Matt had left: canned food, bottled water, a flashlight with extra batteries. There was no electricity, just an old propane stove for cooking and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I lit a fire, made some soup, and ate in silence. Outside, the trees swayed slightly in the wind. I tried to let the quiet relax me, but it didn't. Felt wrong, like the forest was watching. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dull red glow. Then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate crunch outside. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Slow, careful, not an animal. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The only weapon I had was a hunting knife Matt had left in one of the kitchen drawers. Another step, closer now. Then it stopped. I strained my ears, waiting. Nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I let out a slow breath. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the leaves. I told myself that over and over, but I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came and everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been out there. I told myself I had overreacted. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping wood, checking the nearby stream for fresh water, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the feeling never left. The sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, kept the knife within reach. It didn't help. The knocking started just past midnight. Soft, slow. Knock, knock, knock. Not at the door, at the window. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The window had no curtains, no way to block out whatever was outside. I didn't move. The knocking came again. I forced myself to look. Nothing, just the darkness pressing against the glass. I sat in bed, gripping the knife, waiting. The knocking never came again, but I didn't sleep. I woke up exhausted, every muscle tense. I stepped outside, scanning the ground, and then I saw them. Footprints.
Bore.
Human, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. I grabbed my keys, threw open the car door. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Not loose. Gone. A sound behind me, a soft rustling in the trees. I turned, scanning the forest. Nothing. But I knew someone was there, watching, waiting. I grabbed the knife and backed toward the cabin. If I couldn't leave, I needed to survive the night. I barricaded the door, stacked furniture against it, kept the knife in my hand. The knocking started at midnight, not just at the window this time, the walls, the door, soft, deliberate taps, like they were playing with me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the doorknob turned, slow, testing. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The sound stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Leaving. Circling. Fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. Didn't move. Just waited for morning. First light, I ran. I didn't pack. Didn't look back. Just sprinted down the dirt road, heart hammering. I ran for almost an hour before I saw another car. An older man driving a pickup. He slowed when he saw me, eyes wide. I must have looked insane. He drove me to the nearest town. I called Matt, told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "My uncle stopped going up there too. I never asked why. I didn't want to know. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, when everything is too quiet, I swear I still hear knocking." I rented the cabin because I needed time alone. No real reason, just the usual stress of life stacking up, making me feel like I was constantly running on empty. My job had been draining me. My apartment felt suffocating, and I couldn't remember the last time I had a full night's sleep, so I found the place online. The listing described it as secluded, quiet, a true off-the-grid experience. It was cheap, sitting deep in the woods of Colorado, miles from the nearest paved road. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just peace and quiet. The thought of it made me feel like I could finally breathe. I packed a week's worth of food, warm clothes, a few books, and an old rifle my dad had given me years ago. Not that I expected to need it, I just liked having it around. I left early in the morning, not realizing it would be the longest drive of my life. The first half of the trip was easy, just highways and long stretches of empty road. It wasn't until I left the last small town behind that the world started feeling empty. The paved roads turned into dirt. No more streetlights, no more houses. Just trees, endless trees, pressing in on both sides. The further I drove, the rougher the road became. Potholes, deep tire grooves, rocks big enough to rattle my truck. No signs, no markers, nothing but the GPS on my phone telling me I was going the right way. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. It was smaller than I expected, one story with siding, tin roof, a small porch out front. Old, but sturdy. It had a single window in the front and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I parked, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The silence hit me first. No cars, no distant hum of life, just the wind moving through the trees. It was what I wanted, but standing there, with nothing but miles of wilderness around me, I felt something unexpected, unease. I shook it off and went inside. The inside was basic, a small kitchen, a single bed, an old wood stove. There was a musty smell in the air, like the place hadn't been lived in for a long time. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner, and sat by the wood stove as it crackled and popped. It should have been peaceful. Instead, I kept listening. The wind outside, the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. Every little sound felt too loud. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I heard it, a rustling sound. Close. I opened my eyes in the darkness, heart pounding. Then, a soft thud against the wall outside. Not an animal. Too deliberate. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for something else. Minutes passed, then nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, just me adjusting to the silence. I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and stopped cold. Footprints. Deep, clear footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from the trees. Nothing. I followed the tracks. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I scanned the woods, my skin crawling. No sign of anyone. I went back inside and locked the door. The rest of the day, I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I read, I chopped some wood, I tried to enjoy the quiet. But every time I looked at the trees, I felt like someone was looking back. I barely slept. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind, the trees, my own breathing. Then a noise on the porch. A slow, steady creak of wood under weight. Someone was out there. I didn't move. Then, a soft knock on the door. Not loud, not frantic, just a knock. My body locked up. Who would be out here? Why knock? I waited, heart hammering. After what felt like forever, the porch creaked again. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and with it, a decision. I was leaving. I packed my bag, grabbed my rifle, and stepped outside. That's when I saw it. The attic hatch was open. It was small, near the kitchen, barely noticeable unless you looked up. But now it was open just a few inches. I hadn't noticed it before. A sick feeling curled in my stomach. I grabbed a flashlight, aimed it up, and forced myself to pull the hatch down. A wooden ladder unfolded. I hesitated. Then I climbed. The attic was tiny, just a crawl space filled with dust. But in the corner, a sleeping bag, a pile of food wrappers, and a knife. Someone had been living up here, watching me. The footprints, the knocks, the sounds in the night. They had been inside the cabin the whole time. I ran. I didn't pack the rest of my things. I didn't check anything else. I sprinted to my truck, turned the key, nothing. The engine was dead. Panic slammed into me. I grabbed my rifle, ran back inside, and locked the door. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to think. Then footsteps, outside, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I gripped the rifle, heart pounding. Then I heard it, the attic hatch creaking open again. My blood went cold. They weren't outside. They were inside. I turned just as something moved in the corner of my vision, and everything went black. I woke up to daylight. My head ached. My hands were tied. I was in the back of my own truck, lying on the dirt road, staring at the sky. The cabin door was wide open, the attic hatch empty. Whoever had been there was gone, and they had left me alive. I don't know why. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I will never go back.